Well, greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We are well into the spring here, and we continue with our virtual Voices of the Game series, something that we have been doing since 2020. I'm very glad to have with us a special guest today, Tim Kurkjian. We're going to properly introduce Tim in just a moment. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Marcus, and I work in the Hall of Fame's Education Department. Very glad that you could be with us today. Tim Kurkjian is certainly a timely guest, the winner of the BBWAA Career Excellence Award. He'll be honored in Cooperstown coming up in late July. He has written for such newspapers as the Dallas Morning News, the Baltimore Sun. He's been a beat writer for the Texas Rangers and the Baltimore Orioles, was a senior writer for Sports Illustrated, and starting in 1998, has worked as a writer and broadcaster for ESPN, where he continues to this day. We're very glad to welcome to the Hall of Fame airwaves, Tim Kurkjian. Tim, how are you doing?
I'm well, Bruce. And if I love baseball more than you, then that's really saying something, because I know how much you love the game.
You know, I think you do. I think you're the kind of guy who all your dreams about baseball, you wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night and you're thinking about baseball, thinking about the next game, the next day, the next interview you're going to do. I would say you're one of those people that you're 100% diehard. There's no give there.
Well, I will say, Bruce, that I'm sure you, as an adult, did not clip out every box score of every major league game and tape them in notebooks like I did for 20 years without ever missing a day. And I think we can all agree that's a streak that even Cal Ripken would be proud of. So I'm not sure my obsession with baseball is completely healthy, but those are the things that I've done in my career just because I do. I wake up in a cold sweat if I feel unprepared, and having my box score book with me wherever I went was a very comforting feeling.
Did you clip the box scores for that 20-year period of time simply because you enjoyed it, or did you feel, hey, this is going to help me do my job better?
Oh, absolutely helped me do my job. Let's say, Bruce, I was taking a flight from Washington, D.C., where I live, to San Diego. And, there's no internet on board. There was no internet back then. So if I had all my box scores with me, I could run through every game that the Padres had played that year. And even though it doesn't tell you everything, you read the box scores closely enough, you're going to learn an awful lot every day. So I had my box scores with me because it made me a better reporter. It made me a better writer. And the first year I stopped doing it only because I couldn't find all the box scores the next day, because the newspaper business just didn't have all 15 games every night. I would look for my box score book and it wasn't there. And I don't care how corny it sounds, I would miss it.
Yeah. It's hard to find those box scores in the print format today. It's also in the papers that I get. And I usually read New York Post, New York Daily News. We get those papers up in this area. And they don't have the Sunday statistics the way that they used to. And they used to list them by highest batting average to lowest batting average. I haven't seen that in any print format in years, and I really miss that.
Oh, Bruce, every Sunday morning, we would look, my dad, my two brothers, and I, we would look at those averages and to see who's leading the league and hitting at this moment and who's under 200 at this moment. Danny Ainge, who played the major leagues, of course, was a great NBA player also. He was looking at those averages one Sunday in the Celtics locker room as a player for the Celtics. And he showed the averages to all the Celtic players and told them, I told you this game was really hard to play. Look how many guys are hitting under 200. Those are the things that you used to get from those Sunday averages, and I miss them tremendously.
Well, we've given some ideas to some of the newspapers out there. Maybe they'll bring them back at some point. Let's talk about some current events here. Winning the award for this year, it's really the most prestigious award that a baseball broadcaster can earn. Used to be known as the Spink Award, renamed the last couple of years to the BBWAA Career Excellence Award winner. When you first heard that you had won the award, Were you totally caught by surprise?
Well, there were only three of us up for it, so I knew I had a chance. But yes, I was surprised. And it sure didn't help that I was so nervous that I decided to kill some time that morning. So I went to the grocery store, as I do like every day, because I'm the most inefficient shopper in the world. So I was in line at the Harris Teeter self-serve aisle, and I was like dragging a rotisserie chicken across the scanner there when I got a call from Jack O'Connell of the Baseball Writers Association. Now, I did know that Jack only calls you if you win. So I went, oh my goodness, I have to take this call. So he called me, he gave me the sensational news, and then I just started to cry in the middle of the Harris Teeter. So that's how I found out. I'm not sure any other baseball writer found out the same way that I did.
Did your phone light up after that?
Yeah, it really did. I've never seen anything like it. And the next morning was probably the highlight. At 8:30 the next morning, Johnny Bench called me at my house on my cell phone. Johnny Bench. And he said, congratulations, Tim. Welcome to the club. You're one of us now. And let's be clear, Bruce, I'm not in their club. I'm not one of them. But still, the greatest catcher of all time, in my mind, called me to congratulate me. Doesn't get a whole lot better than that.
And by saying that, you have something in common with the great Leonard Coppett. And I know that you knew him. I had a chance to talk to him on a number of occasions. We did programs with him here at the Hall of Fame. But whenever somebody mentioned to Leonard that, he was a Hall of Fame award winner, he would always make a point of saying, now don't put me in the same category as the Hall of Famers. It's a Hall of Fame award, and that's great, and that's prestigious, but it doesn't make me a Hall of Famer in the same sense that they are. So he was very modest about that. And of course, not surprisingly, you're also modest in pointing out that distinction.
Well, I have a part in the Hall of Fame now because of all the Hall of Fame players that I covered. And there is, of course, an enormous difference between a Hall of Fame baseball player and a 5'5" dinky little baseball writer. But I love the game. I loved following those players all those years. And trust me, Bruce, this has been a part of my life since as far, far back as I can remember.
You'll be giving your acceptance speech for the award Saturday, July 23rd at the Glimmerglass Opera here in Cooperstown. How is your written speech proceeding? Are you all set, or you still have a lot to do?
Well, I've already written it, and I've gone through it in my head many, many times. I drive around a lot, Bruce, driving to games and everything else. So I usually take some time to try to do my speech while I'm driving the car without reading it, because I don't want to read it. I want to be able to just speak it. I sent it to Shesta, and I'm just quoting here, he sent me back and said, this is excellent. I'm waiting for just a few suggestions from him on either tightening it up or adding a few things or subtracting a few things. I'm pretty happy with it at the moment, Bruce, but I must tell you, even though I've been out in front of people for a long time, I've never been more nervous in my life about anything. I am scared to death at the thought of standing up at the Hall of Fame and making a speech. I hope, I just pray it works out, because if it doesn't, I will never forgive myself.
I'm confident you'll do very, very well. Just for those who may not know, Shesta is John Shestakowski, who is our vice president of public relations, one of my bosses here at the Hall of Fame as well. And he helped set this interview up today. Now, when we talk about your career, let's go back to the high school days. And when I found this out, that you had actually attended and graduated from Walter Johnson High School, I said to some of my coworkers, I mean, how great is that? The guy who loves baseball more than anybody went to Walter Johnson High School. He must have gone to Christy Mathewson Prep as well.
Well, I always thought, Bruce, there was a little destiny involved, that I went to a high school named after the greatest pitcher of all time, and he is the greatest pitcher of all time. A dear friend of mine said, Tim, if you'd gone to Sandy Koufax High School, then you would say Sandy Koufax is the greatest pitcher ever. No, Walter Johnson is the greatest pitcher ever. I played baseball and basketball there, but more important, I worked for the school paper there. It was called The Pitch. I did some work for the yearbook there. It was called The Windup. And I just loved being at Walter Johnson for those 3 years. And, Walter Johnson, lived in the town next to the town I live in right now. He is buried one town over in another direction. And Bruce, get this, he died on December 10th, 1946. And I was born on December 10th, 1956. So I have all these really cool connections to the greatest pitcher of all time. And I can't even begin to tell you how proud I am that I went to that high school.
Did you know by the end of your term, Tim, at the high school that you wanted to go into baseball or sports and be a writer, be a journalist? Had that already formulated in your mind?
Yeah, because after working for the school paper, and by the way, Bruce, I was a terrible writer in high school. One of my gym teachers came up to me once and said, Tim, that might be the worst story I've ever read in the high school paper. I hope you're not planning on making this your life's work, which of course I did. Yes, when I left Walter Johnson, I said to myself, I am going to make a career somehow in baseball, in part because when I graduated, I was about 5'2½", maybe 110 pounds. So my thought of playing in the big leagues or playing in the NBA, those days were long gone by my senior year in high school. So I said, all right, how am I going to make a career in sports? And, I went to the University of Maryland, and I guess famously my oldest brother, Andy, who was a great college baseball player, and he also went to MIT undergrad, got a doctorate in electrical engineering. He had a chat with my dad, who also went to MIT undergrad. And my brother, Andy, said during my senior year in college, like, how is Tim going to make a living? How is he going to make it in life? He only really loves one thing, and that's baseball. So my dad said, don't worry, Tim will figure it out. So I guess eventually I figured it out. It took me a long time to learn how to write. But Bruce, it was always my love for the game, my passion for the game that kept me going. It wasn't a passion for writing. I don't love being on TV. I just love the game. I love being at the ballpark. And fortunately, that has carried me.
But you've become a great writer. How did you do that? And maybe this is a message for the kids out there who are thinking about becoming writers down the line. There are still some of us. I love to write. Obviously, you're a fantastic writer. How did you improve? How did you take yourself from, this poor writer, according to your high school teacher, to now someone who's really at the top of the profession?
Well, as it turns out, I did have a gift. I just didn't know that I had it. My mother, Joy, was a great writer. She used to write the greatest letters. Her Christmas letter that she would send out to everyone was hysterically funny. She was brilliant. So she gave me the writing gene. My dad taught me to love baseball. My mother taught me to love words. But Bruce, if you want to be a good hitter, you got to take a lot of batting practice. If you want to be a good free throw shooter, you got to shoot a lot of free throws. And if you want to be a good writer, you have to write a lot. So that's what I did. I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. Bruce, I'm in high school. This is pathetic. I would play like Stratomatic or APBA tabletop games all by myself while all my friends are out going out on a Saturday night. And I'm playing these tabletop games by myself. I'm kind of broadcasting them as I'm playing them. And then when the game's over, I would write about the game that I just played. So that's how I continued to get better. Eventually was I just kept writing and writing and writing. And like anything else, the more you do it, the better you get.
Do you write every day?
I write every day. Yes. A couple of years ago during the pandemic, I wrote 101 consecutive days for ESPN.com. I did it was called the baseball fix. For all those people that didn't have baseball because of COVID-19, I just decided to take every day on the calendar and write about what happened on that day. Like it might have been whatever, Ted Williams's birthday or Joe DiMaggio's start of his streak. And that's what I would write about. So I usually write something every day. And it's not a long story every day, but like anything else, if you want to be a good shortstop, you take ground balls every day. And so that I really enjoy writing every day, as long as I'm writing about something baseball related.
Tim, how about the perspective of reading? You hear that a lot, that if you want to become a good or a great writer, you've got to read good writing, great writing. Were there any writers or formats of writing that you really felt compelled to continue to read because not only did you enjoy it, but you sensed this might help me as well?
Yeah, when I was growing up, I read the sporting news from cover to cover. We also got Sports Illustrated at my house. I read that cover to cover. And I read the Washington Post and the Washington Star every day. So I read Shirley Povich growing up. I read Tom Boswell when I was a little bit older. And those are the guys that I kept reading saying, boy, these guys are great. I'll never be like these guys. And then when I got into the business and I started writing, I followed Dan Shaughnessy at the Washington Star. He was our baseball writer and I became the backup. So I watched the way that he did things. And then Peter Gammons, of course, when I started covering full time, I would read his stuff and think, to me, this is the greatest baseball writer of all time. I would read my pal Jason Stark, who had a slightly different way of looking at things than, say, Dan or Peter did. So those are just three guys that I read while I was in the business. But growing up, the formative years, I couldn't get enough baseball, and I read everything I could get my hands on.
We've talked about some of these connections, Walter Johnson High School. This is something I just found out the other day. You have a connection to this guy, a pretty well-known character actor, Matt McCoy.
Yeah.
He graduated from your school same year, class of 74. He is famously known for playing Lloyd Braun on Seinfeld. And if you look at the photo on the right, that's a role that he had in one of my favorite movies of all time, LA Confidential. And there, Matt is playing a character named Brett Chase. So do you remember Matt McCoy from those years in the early 70s?
Well, of course, he was one of my dear friends, and he still is one of my dear friends. And I can tell you, Bruce, I know where he got his start as an actor. He had no interest in doing that, but long term. But in 11th grade English class, Mrs. Mulhouse's class, we did a one-act play, and she was so impressed with his work in the one-act play that she told him, you should consider doing this, long term. And sooner rather than later, he was the star of all the school plays in high school, went on to all sorts of things. And by the way, I could say this, look how handsome that guy is. He and I went on a couple of double dates. Believe me, he arranged the double date. I didn't know how to do that. I still don't know how to do that. So I would hang out with Matt quite a bit in high school, and the girls really liked him, and the girls didn't really like me. So he taught me a few things about how to look better, how to dress, everything else. Matt's a dear friend.
Is he a baseball fan?
Yes, he's not a baseball fan like you are. He's not like I am, but he grew up a Reds fan. He's lived in LA for years. He likes the Dodgers. So yes, we've had many talks about baseball, but mostly I like to ask about his job acting because that's what fascinates me.
Do you still keep in touch with him?
Sure. I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, and he came to my daughter's wedding a couple of years ago, and we're 3,000 miles apart. But every time I go to LA, I always try to find him.
Yeah. I think he's a really good actor. And I'm not just saying this because of the connection to you. He was very funny as Lloyd Braun in that recurring role. I mean, to be in LA Confidential, such a good movie. I mean, that is a highlight of his career. He was also in a terrific movie in the early 90s, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. He played the father in that film. So I mean, he's had a very nice, substantial career. I don't know what he's doing these days, but I think he's still active, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he's making a movie in Mexico as we speak, and it's taken some time. He missed my son's wedding because they were shooting in Mexico, but all good.
Yeah. A final question on the Matt McCoy connection. Have you ever been tempted to ask him to maybe put you in a film, give you a small role?
No, but I will tell you, and I'm going to embarrass him, and I shouldn't do this, but I hope everyone takes this with the right spirit. When I was younger, I used him, I was an umpire, umpiring little kids' games. Well, actually, up to high school. I was like 18, and the kids were 15. So it's like pretty big stuff. We're on the big field. So my base umpire didn't show up for the game, and I'm in big trouble. So I called Matt and said, Matt, I need you to come and work the bases because you have to have two umpires if you're going to umpire the game. So Matt came over. He did a great job, except in the sixth inning, very tense, really important situation, bases loaded. The catcher threw it over the pitcher's head, and the ball was headed towards center field with the bases loaded. And Matt, who's stationed behind home the pitcher's mound, just kind of reflexively scooped it up and threw it back to the pitcher. And the one coach came running out. I thought he was going to crush me. And he just looked at me and he goes, "Where did you get him from?" I said, "Coach, I'm sorry. I didn't have a base umpire. My base umpire made a mistake." I think Matt will even chuckle about that today.
Oh, that's great. That's terrific. Let's talk about baseball per se, and let's talk about boyhood heroes. Now, you were telling me you grew up as a Washington Senators fan, growing up in Bethesda, Maryland, but the guy who was your hero, your favorite player, was all the way on the other coast for the San Francisco Giants. When I say why Willie Mays, it might sound like a silly question because, I mean, he's such an exciting player, dynamic player, but he was so far away. He was on the other coast. Why did Mays serve as the attraction for you?
Well, first off, with the Senators, I loved Eddie Brinkman, their pixie little shortstop, and I love Frank Howard, who hit the longest home runs anyone had ever seen, and that still might go today. However, 65 All-Star game, Bruce, I was 8 years old, and I'm starting to truly understand at 8 what I'm watching here. I've been watching for years before that, but now I'm starting to understand who these guys are and what they do. Willie Mays, to me, looked like the perfect baseball player when it came to size and speed, and he hit a home run to start the 65 All-Star game, and I was just mesmerized. And it was the first game I'd ever seen on a color TV also, which I think added, to the image. So that's where it came from. And then, Bruce, you remember back in the mid 60s, late 60s, there was only one game on per week. It was the Saturday afternoon game of the week. And occasionally the Giants were on. And that was, oh my gosh, appointment viewing that I got to watch Willie Mays take 5 at-bats on a Saturday afternoon. It was the greatest thing I've ever seen. And the really cool part is, Bruce, if I may, I met Willie Mays several times at the Hall of Fame, maybe 15 years ago. I interviewed him and Hank Aaron at the same time. I mean, what a thrill that was for a dinky little baseball writer. And then last year, on his 90th birthday, I wrote a 6,000-word story for ESPN.com about Willie Mays. And it was one of my favorite stories I've ever written. And believe me, I barely wrote it, Bruce. All I did was call about 25 guys in baseball history who had played with or against Willie Mays, Reggie Jackson, Joe Torre. I talked to all these people, and every one of them had a great Willie Mays story. And that's all I did, basically, was run these great anecdotes, these great stories that I got directly from the players that I spoke to. One of my favorite stories I've ever done.
Tim, did you ever get to see Willie in person? I know you saw him on TV all the time, but you were in an American League city. Did you ever have a shot to see him at the ballpark?
I did not. So he retired after the 73 season. The Giants never came near where I lived, and we frankly were not in a financial position to say, hey, let's get on a plane and go watch Willie Mays. Maybe I should have jumped on, told my dad we're driving to Philadelphia when Willie Mays comes through, but
Yeah.
I was awfully young and it just wasn't working that way. So no, I never saw him play in person. I did see Roberto Clemente play in person, and that was about as cool as it gets, other than seeing maybe Willie Mays.
Was that in Pittsburgh?
No, Roberto Clemente played in an exhibition game after the 71 season. The Pirates played in Washington, and they called it like game 8 of the World Series because it was the next spring. And I couldn't wait to go to that. And, all of our friends, a bunch of my friends went, and all I wanted to do, Bruce, was to see 2 things. I wanted to see him hit one of those laser shot line drives to right field like only he could. And then, of course, he did. And then we had to watch him throw from right field. And he made a throw from right field to third base that I will never forget. It was 50 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday.
Jumping back to Willie Mays for a moment, the first time that you talked to him, how nervous were you?
Well, I was scared to death because it was Willie Mays, and it was just him and I, and it was a brief conversation, but he was very cordial to me. I only had a couple questions for him because I didn't want to take his time. So that was the first time. But as I referenced, the second time was the really cool one at the Hall of Fame, where I'm standing between Hank Aaron and Willie Mays, and I'm going back and forth asking questions to those 2 guys. And then 10 minutes later, I interviewed Ted Williams. So in a 10-minute span, Bruce, at the Hall of Fame, I interviewed Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, and Ted Williams, which that day was the highlight of my professional career until, if I may, 4 years ago, Hank Aaron sat in our broadcast booth in Atlanta for 4.5 innings. And Dave Fleming, Eduardo Perez, and I did a baseball game on television with Hank Aaron sitting right next to us. Bruce, I stopped keeping score of the game because I no longer was interested in what Ozzie Albies was doing. I was sitting next to Hank Aaron. He was so funny. He was so charming. And his recall on the stories he told were just fabulous. So the game ends. I checked Twitter after the game. Never a good idea, Bruce, to check Twitter after you've just broadcast a game. And some guy wrote on Twitter, he said, if anyone ever looks at you like Tim Kurkjian looked at Hank Aaron tonight, you should marry that person. That's how captivated I was from sitting next to one of the 5 greatest players of all time for 4.5 innings. It was just the most breathtaking night for me professionally.
Oh, that's amazing. We talked earlier that you did grow up as a Washington Senators fan, but then when the Senators left and they became the Texas Rangers in 1972, you shifted over to the Baltimore Orioles, and you got a chance to watch this guy on a fairly regular basis, Brooks Robinson. This is one of the many great plays he made in that 1970 World Series against the Big Red Machine. Tell us a little bit what it was like being, relatively close to Baltimore in the early 70s and getting a chance to watch this guy.
Oh my goodness, Brooks Robinson. If I could name a favorite player through my entire career, I think it's him, because he is the single nicest baseball player I have ever met in my life. When I started covering the Orioles for the Washington Star, Brooks was one of the broadcasters, and I sat next to him on the bus multiple times. We would have cookouts in spring training in the mid-'80s. I'm covering the team as the beat writer for the Sun, and Brooks Robinson would come to those. And I can't even begin to tell you, Bruce, what that was like, speaking to Brooks Robinson face to face and him treating me, which is ridiculous, as an equal, because he is the nicest man in the world. So I once asked him about, fielding the bunt. Nobody made the bunt play better than Brooks Robinson. So he told me the story that Robin Roberts was traded to the Orioles late in his career. So he doesn't even recognize exactly how great Brooks Robinson is. So there's a swinging bunt down the third baseline, and Robin Roberts cuts in front of Brooks Robinson to make the play. And he doesn't make the play. And Brooks pats him on the butt and says with a little smile, "Next time, let me have that one. I'm good on that play." Good on that play, Bruce. Nobody's ever been better on that play. So after Brooks retired after the 77 season, they had a banquet, featuring him. And Gordon Beard, one of my dear friends, sports writer for the AP, he made a speech at Brooks's retirement, and he said this. He said, in New York, they named a candy bar after Reggie Jackson. Here in Baltimore, we name our children after Brooks Robinson. And that kind of sums up what kind of player and what kind of guy Brooks Robinson was and still is.
One of the many amazing things about Brooks Robinson is that when you looked at him back in the 60s and 70s, he was not very physically impressive. He was not what you would necessarily call a great athlete, at least on the surface. And then when you saw him play third base, which wasn't even his original position, it was like he transformed himself into somebody else.
It was amazing. He's a second baseman who became a third baseman. That's a very difficult transition. He had a very quiet body, Bruce, which you have to when you play third base. It is not a position where you can panic, okay? You have to be quiet because the ball is going to hit you at all angles. Doug Rader, former third baseman, once told me that playing third base is like recovering a fumble. And Brooks never panicked. He was never in a rush at that position. And no one has ever played that position better than him. And I'm sure you know this, Bruce, but he writes and eats with his left hand. I was always fascinated by that. And again, there are others like that, but Brooks Robinson was very dexterous with his left hand. He would eat and write with it. So Davey Johnson, who joined the Orioles in the mid-60s as their second baseman, meets Brooks Robinson for the first time. And the first thing he recognizes is, geez, Brooks eats and writes with his left hand. And Davey told me that he ate and wrote with his left hand for a year in hopes it would make him a better second baseman. He said, it didn't work at all, but I had to try it because it sure worked for Brooks Robinson.
Actually, I had not heard that about Brooks. That's something I'd never heard of for some reason. That's interesting.
Right. Larry Bird is that way. And Babe Ruth is the opposite. Babe Ruth ate and wrote with his right hand and played baseball left-handed. Love that stuff.
Tim, one of your early jobs, 1980s, early 80s, 1981, you become the beat writer for the Texas Rangers for the Dallas Morning News. There we see a picture of you, I guess, circa that era. When I think of the 81 Rangers, I think of Al Oliver, Mickey Rivers, some of those players. Talk about becoming a beat writer for that team. What was that experience like?
Well, in spring training of that first year, Mickey Rivers came up to me, and I love Mickey Rivers. Mickey Rivers asked if he could borrow $2,000 from me. I said, Mick, I'm making $14,000 a year. I don't have $2,000 to my name. I can't lend you any money. I don't have any money. That was my first spring with the Rangers, and it was wonderful. The guys I met that spring, Charlie Huff for the first time, Buddy Bell, Larry Parrish, Al Oliver, it was tremendous. And the key was Don Zimmer was the manager, Bruce. And Zim I guess he recognized that I was like 14 years old. I looked like I was 10. I was totally overmatched in a lot of things because I was 5'5" and I weighed 130 pounds. But he recognized pretty quickly, all right, I don't know if this guy knows what he's doing, but he sure loves baseball. So the Rangers had lost 11 games in a row, and it was May. And I staggered into Zim's office in May with some haggard look on my face. And this was a very important moment of my career. So Zim looks at me and he goes, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Well, Zim, I must say, covering this team hasn't been as much fun as I thought it would be." So he looked at me, and I'm quoting here. He said, "Quit complaining. Look at yourself. You're young. You're good looking. You got your whole life in front of you." He said, "Look at me. I'm old. I'm fat. I'm bald. I'm ugly. I got a plate in my head, and I've got this team to manage. I'm the one with all the worry. So why don't you quit complaining, and why don't you understand how lucky you are to be covering Major League Baseball every day at your age?" And that, I didn't need to be reminded. I really didn't, Bruce. I knew right away how fortunate I was. But when, baseball's Buddha, Don Zimmer, gives you that little lecture, you turn around and say, well, you're absolutely right. I was the most fortunate man in the world to be at that age, coming to a major league team, and I never complained another time after that.
I got to ask you this as a follow-up. Did Mickey ever come up to you again asking for more money?
Yes, he did one other time. Mickey was so much fun to be around. You had to love him. We were in Milwaukee once, and the wind was really howling in Milwaukee. And after the game, I asked him about it, and he said, "I'm telling you, the wind was blowing 68 degrees today. 68 degrees today." He said, "I felt like the lost Mohican out there." Bruce, the lost Mohican out there. That's who Mickey was. There was nobody better than him.
Of course, here in Cooperstown, we better know the last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper, because he lived here and he wrote about the lake in several of his books. Mickey, one of the great characters in baseball. One of my favorite people in baseball was with that team. He's pictured on the screen, Al Oliver. Tim, how well did you get to know Al?
Well, Al got traded that first spring training. So unfortunately, I only got to know him for 5 weeks, but I enjoyed every moment of talking to Al Oliver. By the way, Bruce, that was a guy that could really, really hit. And we sat and talked about a lot of things, the Pittsburgh days. We talked about him being such a great hitter, where the name Scoop came from, because as a first baseman, he could scoop the ball out. But he got traded for Larry Parrish at the end of spring training in a very, very important deal. And he went to the Expos. And this is so classic Al Oliver. This is why I love him. I saw him at the All-Star break. So the last I'd seen him was in spring training the day he got traded. Then I see him in the middle of July. I go up and shake his hand on the field. The game was being played in Montreal. I shook his hand and I said, "Al, good to see you. How you doing, Al?" And he said, "I've had 75 line drives caught the first half of the season." That's what he said. It's the first thing he said. Now, we might, in today's era, have been able to prove how many line drives he had actually had caught, but that was Al. And he was hitting like 340 at the All-Star break, and he had, according to him, 75 line drives caught. That's who Al Oliver was. He loved to hit and loved to talk about hitting.
Tim, one final question on those Rangers years in the early 80s. There was a writer named Mike Shropshire, wrote a terrific book, Seasons in Hell, about the Rangers of the very early years. Billy Martin, Whitey Herzog were the managers. And he wrote many funny stories, but he also talked about the unbearable heat in Texas and how difficult that not only was for the players, but for everybody. Did the heat affect you? Was the heat something that was just so oppressive that it took its toll? Or did you become used to it after a while?
Well, I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, and that's not the same heat as Texas, but it gets awfully humid here in July and August, and it's not a particularly comfortable place to live. So yes, I'm used to the heat. And I'm also, again, at the time, I weighed about 130 pounds, not much more today, by the way, Bruce. So little guys don't seem to sweat quite as much, I think. So I think I was okay there, but I was fascinated. My first year there on the beat, I think it was over 100 degrees for 42 straight days in Texas. And on the old Arlington Stadium scoreboard, they had a digital temperature gauge that was a gigantic sign. So I can't tell you how many times they would start a night game in Texas and it was still 100 degrees. That's how hot it was there. And it didn't affect me, but it affected the players eventually. Eventually, that heat will wear you down at the end.
And there was no shade at that old ballpark either. 86, you move on to the Baltimore Orioles. You come back to your hometown state. Not only do they have two Hall of Fame players, Eddie Murray and Cal Ripken Jr., but Earl Weaver has come back to manage the team. Tell us about being a beat writer for an Earl Weaver team.
Well, Earl, to me, is one of the 3 or 4 greatest managers of all time. Nobody has ever taught me more about the game than Earl Weaver did. And I loved being around him so much. I covered him a little in 79, a little in 80, a little more in 81, and every day in 86. Earl was a character of the highest order. He was brilliant in his simplicity. Always keep the double play in order. Don't bunt unless you have to. And when they want to bunt, throw the ball over the plate. They are giving us an out. Let them give us an out. He made us laugh also so many times, Bruce. And it was a danger as a beat guy that Earl was so colorful and so funny and so good after the games that sometimes you'd go down to the clubhouse to talk and with a story, and usually you have a story in your head. Sometimes you go down there and say, well, Earl is just going to carry me because nobody's better after a game than Earl Weaver. And there are a million Earl Weaver stories, but the best one, of course, is when Pat Kelly, a former outfielder for the Orioles, still on the team, decided to become a minister while he was playing in the major leagues. So he waited for the right moment, the poignant time to go tell his manager, Earl Weaver, about his big plans. He finally finds it and he goes to Earl and he goes, Earl, I'm going to walk with the Lord. And Earl said, I'd rather you walk with the bases loaded. That's pretty much how Earl did things in Baltimore, but he was the Earl of Baltimore in every way. Hilarious, brilliant, and I enjoyed so much the 86 season because I was with him every day.
The two Hall of Fame players, Eddie Murray, who, as great a player as he was, didn't particularly care for sports writers. And then you've got, still at this point, a relatively young Cal Ripken. Talk about covering players like that on a day-to-day basis.
Well, Eddie Murray didn't like me, I can tell you that. We did talk basketball. He loved basketball, and so do I. So we could talk basketball occasionally, but whenever then I transitioned to asking him baseball questions, a lot of times he just kind of whisked me away. That was just Eddie's way. I don't think it was anything personal. I sure hope not. I know he got mad at me for something I wrote once, and he went years without talking to me, but none of that is the point, Bruce. I covered a Hall of Fame first baseman, one of the greatest switch hitters of all time. And Earl Weaver said during Eddie Murray's rookie year, he's like 2 months in, he tells all the beat writers, this is going to be a Hall of Fame player 2 months into his major league career. That's what Earl saw in Eddie, and Eddie and I had a rocky relationship. I'm not proud of that, by the way. I think we've all patched it up, so that's good. As for Cal Ripken, I think I'm going to have to say I've written more words about Cal Ripken than I've written about any person in all the years that I've covered. I got to know him really well. He let me into places like his house and his car and his workout facilities and all that not everyone was invited to. I played basketball with him many times, which is a raging conflict of interest. I shouldn't have done that, but it was fascinating nonetheless. So covering Cal Ripken every day was so revealing for me. And I'm just going to say it one time, Bruce, I'm not angry. I'm not angry at anybody else, but he was the best player. He was the best shortstop they had every single night. And people who think that streak was selfish and he shouldn't have done that, I was there for 4 of those years. He should have played every game, and he did. And he went, Bruce, 3 years without missing an inning. And that night in Toronto, 1987, the Orioles were losing like 18-4. And the Blue Jays hit 10 homers that night, Bruce, a major league record, 10 homers in one game. And I'm writing the story for the Baltimore Sun that the Orioles got clobbered and became the first team ever to give up 10 homers. And then I looked out on the field and Cal Ripken was not running to shortstop. So for the first time in 3.5 years, he came out of a game. His father took him out of the game because the team, the general manager, Hank Peters, who I love, said, look, this is not worth, he can play in every game. He doesn't have to play every inning. Let's give him a rest. So I had 2 of the biggest stories I've ever had to deal with, and they both happened at basically 10 o'clock at night, and my story was due at 10:20. That's what we call working on deadline.
Yeah. I think you make a great point. And I remember I was doing talk radio back in the late 80s, early 90s. And people would sometimes call up and say, Ripken needs to take a day off here and then. He's slumping, he's not hitting. And then I would try to make the counter argument similar to what you said. Well, who would they put out there that's any better? Defensively, even if he was in a slump, even if his bat was dragging, he was making all the plays. He was the best defensive shortstop they had. And certainly nobody that they would use as a utility player who would become a starting shortstop. No one was going to produce anywhere near what he could offensively. It didn't help. It wouldn't help the team. It was something that he did. Now, maybe he had personal motivation. Maybe he wanted at some point to, set the new record in terms of this playing streak. But it always helped the team, I thought. Always.
Absolutely. He's one of the most underrated defensive players of all time. You really had to watch him every day to understand just how terrific a defensive shortstop he was. Yes, he didn't have Ozzie Smith's range. No one's ever had Ozzie Smith's range. But you hit a ball to Cal Ripken, he's going to make the play. Absolute IQ for the game as high as anyone I've ever seen. And there was no defensive shortstop on their team that came close to him. That's why he should have played every game. That, and he ran the entire defense while he was playing shortstop.
What was his father like? Not a lot written about Cal Ripken Sr., but tell us about the elder Ripken.
He was, I think I have to say, he's the toughest man that I've ever met in a major league uniform. This is way too graphic, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. This is where Cal Jr. gets it from. His dad used to play soccer in his mid-50s. Play the midfield and play against a bunch of 20 and 25-year-olds, and he played the whole game in his mid-50s. A couple times he came back to the house with a blood blister under his big toe, a really painful blood blister. And he would take his son, Cal Jr., down into the workroom in the basement of the house. Sorry, Bruce. He took out a power drill and he drilled into his toenail, and the blood came spurting out, and he looked at his son, Cal Jr., and went, oh, that feels good. That's where the toughness comes from. And almost as graphic, Cal Sr. got hit with a line drive in the face at Fenway Park one night before a game. He didn't get behind the screen in time. He got hit right here. Blood is spurting out of his face. And Richie Bancells, the trainer, comes running out because he thinks Cal Sr. is dead. By the time he gets to the mound, Cal Sr. is up. He looks at the trainer, Richie Bancells, and says, what the hell are you doing out here? I haven't finished my round. He finished his round of batting practice with blood spilling out of his face. He went to the hospital, got it stitched up, and was back in the third base coach's booth in the third inning. That's who Cal Ripken Sr. was.
Remarkable. After those Orioles years, you move on to Sports Illustrated. You work there for several seasons. Then from there, you jump over to ESPN. You've been with ESPN since 1998. And of course, with ESPN, you work both as a broadcaster and as a writer. Tell us about making that transition, because I don't believe you'd had a lot of experience in front of the microphone. How difficult was that?
Well, I thought it was really difficult, but fortunately, my beat writer newspaper days trained me to do that. Beat writing taught me to write quickly, to write on deadline. It taught me where the story is and how to get the story. Then I just had to change how I presented it on the air, which was not easy. I'm used to writing a 25-inch game story, 25 paragraphs, let's say. Now I have to make my point in 30 seconds and get the heck out of there. You have to be a lot more efficient on TV. So my writing days prepared me to be a writer. When I went to ESPN, I thought they were going to teach me how to do this. Like, are you guys going to show me how to do TV? And they said, no, there's no time. You're a writer. You'll figure it out. And they just popped me right on. It was difficult. And, I spent a fortune on clothes. I was a baseball writer. I'm sitting next to Harold Reynolds, who's wearing a $2,000 suit. I spent a lot of time walking around in a circle talking to myself, which I didn't often do as a baseball writer. And I started wearing more makeup than my wife because that's what television called for. So there were a lot of adjustments along the way, but I will say this about TV. I've really enjoyed it because, Bruce, of the spontaneity. All right. The game is over. We're on live TV and I get to talk about the World Series right now. At Sports Illustrated, I would have to wait a whole week to see the work that I did. Even at a newspaper, I would have to wait till the next morning to see my work. It is so rewarding to do television and be able to weigh in on something right now.
What's more difficult now, all these years later? Is it sitting in front of a computer trying to create words and paragraphs, or going on national television in front of millions of people and spontaneously, as you say, reacting to what you're saying? What's the more difficult?
Well, they're both really difficult on certain days for me still, but writing is still the hardest thing that I have to do. And that's why it's the most rewarding job that I have, is because it is so difficult. There are days, Bruce, I sit down and I tap it out and I look at it and go, this is terrible. And I have to start all over, or I have to polish it 1,000 times in order to make it better. So writing for me is always harder. But, being on TV is not an easy thing to do. And I'm not underestimating that. I get nervous once in a while still, especially if I don't know what I'm talking about. That's why I try to prepare for everything I'm doing, so I do know what I'm talking about.
Well, the great broadcasters, they make it look easy, but it isn't easy because you're supposed to look in a certain direction. You have to worry about makeup and physical appearance. It's a lot more superficial than writing in many ways. But there's a lot going on. And knowing that at that one moment, millions are staring at you. Some of them may be looking for you to make a mistake so they can write about it on Twitter. That, right, I think would make it almost nightmarish in some situations.
Yeah, well, I say a little message to myself every time I go on TV is, just be careful. Don't say the wrong thing. Don't mess up here, because you're right. It'll be everywhere if you do.
We have a few minutes remaining with the great writer and broadcaster, Tim Kurkjian. If you have questions for Tim, please post them into the chat. We do have a comment from one fan who just wanted to pass along congratulations. His name's Daryl Verbonik. Please pass my congratulations on to Tim. He is my true favorite baseball writer. Another message just came in. I believe it's Wayne Laufert. Tim, for how long did you play Stratomatic baseball? Maybe you still do. Any memories or thoughts about it?
Well, I started out, as I told you, playing APBA. And then when I was in high school, I played them both, but I switched to Stratomatic because I thought it was even more intricate. I played it through, when I started covering baseball, I stopped playing it. Although John Miller, Hall of Fame broadcaster, was the broadcaster for the Orioles. And I left something at the ballpark. He brought it back to his room, and I had to run up to his room at midnight to pick up my notebook or what I forgot there. And John Miller, the broadcaster, was in his room having just called a major league game, and he was playing Stratomatic in his room. I thought that was so great. And I found in my years, everyone played APBA or Stratomatic. In fact, Keith Hernandez told me that when he went to pro ball, he's packing to go to pro ball. He's been drafted. He packs his Stratomatic to take with him. And his father said, Keith, you can't take Stratomatic with you. You're a professional baseball player. And Keith said, but Dad, I'm halfway through the 1970 season. So I was shocked, and I loved it, that a great Major League Baseball player like Keith Hernandez was playing it all through high school and even wanted to take the game to pro ball.
Tim, you've been covering baseball for more than 40 years. You've obviously been a fan longer than that. What's the best part of the game today, 2022?
Well, the best part of the game is, as it always is, the players. But the difference with the players now is this, Bruce. I have never seen this many big, strong, fast, young, athletic players. I have never seen an influx of this many great, young, big, fast stars that have come in the last 10 or 11 years, starting with Mike Trout and Bryce Harper. And ever since then, the people that we see on a daily basis. The first time I saw Aaron Judge, I went, oh my gosh. I saw Wander Franco for the first time a couple years ago. I couldn't believe he was only 19 years old with a body like that. Fernando Tatis Jr., the first time I met him, I couldn't believe how tall he was, and to be able to move like that. That's the best part of the game, is just how physically gifted the players are. And that's not to say they understand how to play the game like Paul Molitor, George Brett, Robin Yount, Cal Ripken did. I don't think they play the game the same way. But when it comes to overpowering the game with your physical gifts, I've never seen anything like I've seen the last 12 years or so.
You mentioned Aaron Judge. I've never seen anybody like him. Frank Howard, I guess, would be the closest thing. And you being a Senators fan in the late 60s, early 70s, you would have seen Frank Howard play. Frank had a similar size to Judge, but wasn't the athlete, didn't have the quickness, the speed, or the agility of somebody like Aaron Judge.
Right. Now you're absolutely right, Bruce. But Frank Howard did get 33 rebounds in one game for Ohio State. He was a darn good basketball player. But Aaron Judge is a better athlete than Frank Howard was. And I think it really, really helps baseball that young people look at Aaron Judge and know he could have had some sort of career in basketball because he was a pretty good player. He definitely could have had a career in football because he was a good high school football player. He chose baseball. It does tremendous good for the game when a guy like that, an African-American player, is that good at it and that athletic at that size. Because Bruce, like anyone who loves the game, this is not an easy game to play when you're 6'7" and 282 pounds. Yeah. Pitchers will chop you up when you're that size, but Aaron Judge has figured out how to be a really, really good player.
One final question from the audience. This may be somebody you know. His name's Steve Lodge. Congrats, Tim. I went to Walter Johnson High School during your era, graduated a year later, 1975. Obscure question. In 1994, we moved to your old neighborhood. We lived just off Stoneham Road in Bethesda. Was that your old street back in the high school days?
Yes. I lived at 6219 Stoneham Road. And if I may, I went to speak at my elementary school many years ago, Ashburton Elementary School, and I spoke to the fifth graders and I explained where I lived. I lived, really close to Ashburton Elementary. I lived on Stoneham Road. So this little girl came up to me. She was in the third grade and she said, "What street number did you live on Stoneham Road?" I said 6219, and she says, that's my house now. So when we moved out, one little girl came to listen to me, and she is now living in the house I grew up in. And I said, which bedroom is yours? And she goes, top one on the left. And I said, that was my brother's bedroom with me. And she just got such a kick out of that. More important, so did I.
Wow. I love going back to my old neighborhood and seeing the old house, even if it's just from the outside. I get a thrill from doing that. Do you do something like that at all?
Yeah, I've done that. I went back to Stoneham Road years after we left, and we lived there for a long time. And I just very politely said, can I just walk in the front door and see the house I grew up in? And the woman was more than happy to let me in. So yeah, I believe in that stuff, because just about everything I have today started, in Bethesda, Maryland on Stoneham Road. So yes, that was a great thrill.
Always important to remember your roots. We're a little over a month, about 6 weeks away from Hall of Fame weekend. We have 7 new Hall of Famers coming in. We, of course, have you winning the Writers Award, the late Jack Brainey, a player who became a broadcaster, winning the Ford C. Frick Award. As you get closer and closer to Hall of Fame weekend, what's going through your mind? Do you find yourself reflecting more on your career because of this Hall of Fame association? Tell us about that.
Well, I find myself getting more and more nervous and more scared, as I told you. It's been an overpowering last 6 months since I got the nomination and then won this award. But my friends say, you're going to be in the Hall of Fame for the rest of your life. Your picture's going to be in there. I just can't think that way. It's just too overwhelming for me. And mostly I think about what Cal Ripken said the night that he broke Lou Gehrig's record for consecutive games played. One of his seminal quotes from that game was, I can't believe this is happening to me. And as we all know, it could only happen to Cal Ripken, given the way that he played the game. But I wake up a bunch of times in the middle of the night thinking about July 23rd, and I ask myself, this can't be happening to me.
As we get set to wrap up our program, just a few more images of Tim Kurkjian. Here's one from a recent All-Star game in Washington, where he got to play, I believe, the celebrity softball game, if I'm not mistaken. Some of his comrades at ESPN, Carl Ravitch and Eduardo Perez. Also wanted to mention that in addition to everything else that Tim has done and we've talked about, he's written some great books. I actually worked on the book on the left, America's Game, which was a Hall of Fame book a number of years ago. It was a lot of fun working on that book, a pop-up book, as I recall. He's also done the other titles that you see. So when we talk about Tim as a broadcaster and as a newspaper writer, also a tremendous author, it's been a phenomenal career and justly rewarded with the 2022 BBWAA Career Excellence Award. Tim, I couldn't be happier for you. It's been a real thrill for me to talk to you over this past hour. And for me, one of the highlights coming up this Hall of Fame weekend will certainly be your award. It's so well deserved.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Thanks to everyone at the Hall of Fame. And thank you for today. This was a thrill for me. You have no idea.
Great Tim Kurkjian has been our guest, Virtual Voices of the Game. We thank Tim very much for his time. We also thank everybody for taking the time to watch the program. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.